At 10:30 on the morning of the 10th of January, 1901, the drilling crew on a low Texas hill called Spindletop lost their fight with the well, and 6 tons of pipe blew out of the ground ahead of a black column of oil that climbed more than 100 feet into the air. From that one well would come Gulf Oil and the company the world now calls Texaco, and with them the birth of the modern American oil industry. But the man who first swore there was oil beneath that hill would never share in it. The greatest fortune would travel north to a banking dynasty in Pittsburgh, and within 3 years the richest oil field on earth would be drilled deliberately into a ruin. In its 9 days of wild flow, the Gusher threw out 100,000 barrels a day, and before it was capped, it had produced more oil than the whole of Texas had pumped in all of the previous year, and it turned a quiet salt dome hill into the most valuable ground in America. To understand how a single well outside Beaumont remade the century, it is necessary to go back to the years when no one of consequence believed there was anything beneath that hill at all. The experts were certain of it. The United States Geological Survey was certain of it. The men who ran Standard Oil, who by then controlled the refining of nearly all the petroleum in America, were certain that the oil of the future lay where it had always lain, in the fields of Pennsylvania and Ohio, east of the Mississippi River. The hill south of Beaumont was, in the considered judgment of the age, worthless ground. The only man who thought otherwise had a 4th-grade education, 1 arm, and no training in geology whatsoever. It is worth recalling what oil even was in those years, because the men who dismissed the hill were not fools. In 1900, petroleum in America meant mainly 2 things. It was kerosene to light the lamps of farmhouses and city parlors, and it was grease to keep machinery from seizing. Oil was a household good and an industrial lubricant, not yet the lifeblood of a modern economy. The automobile was a rich man's curiosity. The country still ran on coal, on steam, and on muscle. The quantity of oil a sensible man might hope to discover did not threaten any of that, and so the question of where the next field lay seemed a small one. Spindletop would change the scale of the possible so violently that it changed what oil itself was for. The hill that did this was hardly a hill at all. It rose only a few feet above the flat coastal prairie of southeastern Texas, a gentle swell of ground in Jefferson County, 3 miles south of Beaumont, a timber and rice town near the Louisiana line. Local people called it the Big Hill, or sometimes Sour Hill Mound, for the rotten smell that hung about it. Sulphur springs bubbled at its edges. Gas seeped up through the soil in places, enough that a passer-by could touch a flame to the ground and watch it burn. The water there was said to sicken cattle. What lay beneath, though no one yet understood it, was a salt dome, a vast plug of salt driven up from far below over unimaginable ages, which had bent and sealed the rock around it into a trap. Underneath the unremarkable rise of the Big Hill sat one of the great pools of oil on the North American continent. For the whole of human history, it had simply waited. The reason the trained men could not see it was, in part, the training itself. The geology of the day held that oil collected in the folds of buckled rock, in the arched formations called anticlines that had yielded the fields of Pennsylvania, and a soft salt mound on a coastal plain matched none of that. Salt domes were thought to be barren ground. The very feature that made Spindletop one of the richest traps on the continent was the feature that told every expert to look elsewhere. Higgins, who had read enough to be dangerous and not enough to be discouraged, knew none of the theory that said he was wrong. He reasoned instead from what he could see and smell and set alight, from the gas that breathed up through the soil, the mineral water, the faint sheen on the springs. To the men with degrees, these were nuisances. To the brickmaker with one arm, they were the surface of something enormous. The man who guessed at it was named Pattillo Higgins. He had been born at Sabine Pass, on the Texas coast, on the 5th of December, 1863, and his family moved to Beaumont when he was 6. He left school after the 4th grade and went to work beside his father, a gunsmith. As a young man, he was, by nearly every account including his own, a menace. He drank, he brawled, he ran with a hard crowd in the lumber camps along the Texas-Louisiana border, and he tormented the black churchgoers of Beaumont with a cruelty that was casual and habitual. One night, when he was 17, while he was harassing a black congregation at their church, a sheriff's deputy fired a warning shot over his head. Higgins fired back and killed the man. The dying deputy managed one last shot, and it struck Higgins in the left arm, which grew infected and had to be taken off below the elbow. Tried for the deputy's murder, Higgins persuaded a jury that he had fired in self-defense and walked free. The loss of the arm did not at first change him. He returned to the lumber camps and to his wild life with one arm where there had been two. What changed him was a revival meeting. In 1885, Higgins walked into a Baptist tent service in Beaumont and walked out a different man. He gave up the liquor and the brawling, settled in town, and set himself up as a respectable businessman. "I used to put my trust in pistols," he said afterward of the conversion. "Now my trust is in God." The turn was complete enough that he began teaching Sunday school to the young women of his church. It was an ordinary enough redemption for a violent man in a frontier town. What was not ordinary was where his restless mind traveled next. Higgins had gone into the brick business, and brickmaking demanded fuel. Searching for something cheaper than wood or coal, he began to read, in the plain, self-taught way that would define the rest of his life, everything he could find on oil and gas. The more he read, the more he became convinced that the sour springs and the burning ground of the Big Hill were not a curiosity, but a sign. Beneath that mound, he believed, lay oil, and a great deal of it. He persuaded a Beaumont lawyer named George Washington O'Brien, who had noticed oil seepage on the hill as far back as 1865, and a businessman named George Carroll to stand behind him. In 1892, the men formed the Gladys City Oil, Gas, and Manufacturing Company. Higgins named it for Gladys Bingham, a little girl in his Sunday school class. He intended it to be far more than a drilling venture. Higgins drew up plans, carefully platted, for an entire model city to rise on the prairie above the oil he was certain was there. He called it Gladys City, a clean industrial town of factories and houses and schools, laid out along the Southern Pacific Line 3 miles south of Beaumont, powered and made rich by the petroleum beneath it. He had seen the future of the place with remarkable clarity. He had only the order of events wrong, and he had badly misjudged who would be standing on the hill when that future finally arrived. For now, the hill gave him nothing but humiliation. The company sank its first well in 1893, and the shifting sands and unstable clay beneath the mound swallowed the effort and gave back no oil. It drilled again in 1895, and again in 1896. All three were dry holes. Every failure confirmed what the trained men had said from the start. The state's geologists had dismissed Higgins. The United States Geological Survey had agreed that the Gulf Coast held no oil worth the finding. And in Beaumont, a town of perhaps 9,000 people, the verdict hardened into something crueler. By 1896, In the words of the Texas State Historical Association, industry experts and townspeople alike believed Spindletop was worthless and that Higgins was something of a fool. Around town they had taken to calling him the millionaire, and they did not mean it kindly. It was the name a frontier town gives to a man who has staked everything on a dream and has nothing to show for it but a hole in the ground. The investors, exhausted by the cost of drilling into dry earth, lost their patience. Higgins surrendered his place in the company he had founded, though he kept his own leases on the land. The prophet had been cast out of his own temple, and the temple had produced nothing. A lesser man, or a more reasonable one, would have walked away. Higgins did not. Still certain the oil was there, he began placing advertisements in industrial magazines and trade journals across the country, seeking a geologist or an engineer with the skill and the capital to drill the big hill properly. The advertisements ran and were ignored. Out of the entire industry, exactly one man answered. He was a mining engineer named Anthony Francis Lucas, a Croatian-born salt dome specialist then at work in the salt and sulfur mines of Louisiana, and he agreed with Higgins about the hill. In the summer of 1899, the two men struck their bargain, and Lucas took up the drilling that Higgins could no longer afford to do alone. It would be Lucas who finally proved Higgins right, and it would be Lucas, together with the Pittsburgh financiers who came to stand behind him, who would make certain that when the oil at last came roaring out of the ground, Pattillo Higgins was nowhere near it. The one man who answered the advertisements was not a Texan, and was not, by trade, an oilman at all. Anthony Francis Lucas had been born on the Dalmatian coast of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had trained as an engineer, and had served as an officer in the Austrian Navy, which is why, for the rest of his life, men called him Captain Lucas. He emigrated to the United States as a young man in the 1870s, anglicized his name from the Croatian, and made his living in the salt and sulfur mines of coastal Louisiana. It was there, working the buried salt of the Gulf, that he had learned the one thing the trained geologists of America had not. He had learned that great domes of salt and the minerals around them often ran together, that where there was a deep plug of salt there might also be sulfur and gas and oil. So, when Lucas read Higgins's notice and traveled to Beaumont and stood on the Sour Spring Mound, breathing the gas and studying the gentle swell of the ground, he did not see worthless prairie. He saw a salt dome. He saw exactly what Higgins had seen, and unlike Higgins, he carried the credentials to be believed. In June of 1899, Lucas signed a lease with the Gladys City Company to drill the hill, and in a separate agreement he granted Higgins a 10% interest, payment for the help Higgins had given in arranging the deal. It was the last time Pattillo Higgins would hold a meaningful share of his own prophecy. Lucas drilled through the back half of 1899 and into the new year with light equipment of his own, and the hill treated him as it had treated everyone before him. The sand caved, the hole filled. He forced the bit down to 575 feet, struck a promising trace of oil sand, and then ran out of money with the work unfinished. By every reasonable measure he was beaten, as Higgins had been beaten, as the Gladys City Company had been beaten 3 times over. Lucas was ready to quit. What kept the well alive was the pair who would not let him quit. Higgins, still certain of the oil, and Lucas's own wife, Caroline, both pressed the engineer not to surrender, but to go east, to find men with pockets deeper than any in Texas, and to try the hill one more time. It was, as much as any decision in the whole affair, a hinge on which the oil age turned. Lucas gathered his maps and his theories and went looking for money. He found it in Pittsburgh, There he interested two veteran oilmen, James Guffey and John Gailey, who had made and lost fortunes in the fields of Pennsylvania and had lately drilled the modest oil town of Corsicana in north-central Texas. Corsicana was itself an accident of history, a town where men boring for drinking water in the 1890s had struck oil instead, and it had grown into the first true oil field in the state. Nearly everyone who would matter at Spindletop passed through Corsicana first. Guffey and Gailey had drilled there. The Hamill brothers had learned the rotary trade there. And a hard, ambitious former Standard Oil pipeline man named Joseph Cullinan had come down from Pennsylvania to lay the pipelines there, a name that will return to this story when the empires are carved up. Corsicana was the rehearsal. Spindletop would be the performance. Gailey was a wildcatter of near-legendary instinct, a man who found oil by feel. It was Gailey who would walk the big hill and choose, by nothing more than judgment, the exact patch of ground on which to set the derrick. Guffey was the promoter and the financier, the man who handled the money and the contracts. And the money behind Guffey, the deep capital that would actually pay for the steel and the steam and the wages, came from the richest source in the city. It came from the Pittsburgh banking house of the Mellons. The Mellons Private Bank, founded by old Thomas Mellon and run now by his son Andrew, already stood behind iron and coal and aluminum across western Pennsylvania, and it had grown used to owning whatever it financed. Guffey and Gailey approached Andrew Mellon himself, the careful, close-mouthed financier whose family would one day reach from the banks of Pittsburgh into the United States Treasury, and Mellon Capital began to move south toward the Texas coast. There was one source of money that did not move. At some point in the search for funds, the Spindletop prospect was laid before the interests of John D. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil already controlled the refining of very nearly all the petroleum in America. Standard declined it. The greatest oil monopoly in the world was offered a share of the field that would shortly break its hold on the country, and it could see no more value in a Texas salt dome than the geologists could. It is one of the quiet ironies of the story that the empire with the most to lose from Spindletop had been handed the chance to own it and let the chance go. The Pittsburgh men were willing to pay, but they attached a condition, and the condition was Higgins. Guffey wanted the new arrangement made clean of the litigious, self-taught prophet who had started the whole affair. By the terms that took shape in the early months of 1900, Pattillo Higgins was eliminated from the partnership altogether. Lucas himself, the engineer who had staked his career and his name on the hill, was cut to a 1/8 share of whatever he found. The remainder belonged to Guffey, to Gailey, and above all to the Mellon interest, 600 miles north of the prairie where the work was done. The man who had spent a decade insisting the oil was there had been written out of the venture before a single barrel of it reached the air. The dream had been Higgins's. The science was Lucas's. The field would belong to the bank. With the money came the drillers. Guffey and Gailey contracted the finest rotary men they could find, the Hamill brothers of Corsicana, Al and Kurt, with their brother Jim's contracting firm behind them. Al Hamill was 24 years old, tall and spare. The brothers reached Beaumont with their equipment around the 1st of October, 1900, and Lucas carried them out to the hill, where a single 6-inch pipe still rose from the earth, all that remained of the earlier failures. Lucas struck a match and dropped it into the pipe. There was a soft puff, and a flame shot up and died away. The gas was real. The Hamills hauled their rotary drill and their steam boiler to the mound, unloaded a rail car of pipe by hand, and stacked it on a rough rack. And when they went looking for a man in Beaumont who knew how to build an oil derrick, they discovered there was not one in the town. They built it themselves. On the 27th of October, 1900, on a tract called the McFadden, Weiss and Kyle Survey, beside the Gladys City ground, the drilling began. The choice of a rotary rig mattered more than anyone yet understood. The earlier wells had used cable tools, which pounded a hole into the earth by brute percussion, and the cable tool was helpless in loose, wet sand. The rotary rig turned its bit and bored, and it could be made to carry the cuttings up and out as it went. Spindletop would be the first great proving ground for the technology, and the men who turned that bit were about to make it indispensable. The hill, however, fought them from the first foot. There was almost no hard rock near the surface, only hundreds of feet of fine shifting sand, and the sand ran back into the hole as fast as the bit could cut it. The walls caved again and again. Here the Hamels did the thing that would outlast everything else about that winter. To hold the soft walls open, Kurt Hamel stopped flushing the bore with plain water and began pumping a thick mud down into it instead. The mud coated the sides of the hole and sealed them, and the drilling went on. To make the mud, the crew drove cattle into a watered pit beside the rig and let the animals churn the earth and water to slurry under their hooves. It was a crude answer to an immediate problem on one Texas hill. It was also the birth of drilling mud, a method that every oil rig on earth would eventually adopt, and that the industry still calls, more than a century later, by the same plain name. From then on, we operated the rig 24 hours a day, Al Hamel remembered. The bit ground downward through Christmas and into the new year, past 900 feet, past 1,000, until it wedged in a crevice of rock at roughly 1,060 feet. Consider what the gamble had become by then. The hill had already killed 3 dry holes across the 1890s and a fourth, Lucas's own, that died at 575 feet. The new well had been grinding for more than 2 months through sand that caved as fast as it was cut. The Pittsburgh terms had reduced the engineer who believed in the hill to a 1/8 share, and had cut the prophet who found it down to nothing at all. The Hamels, when they began, would have called a well that yielded 50 barrels a day a fine success and gone home content. On the morning of the 10th of January, 1901, they hauled the long string of pipe up out of the hole to change a dull bit, lowered it back toward the bottom, and had gotten down some 700 feet when the ground beneath the derrick began, very quietly at first, to growl. It began as a tremor under the derrick floor, a low vibration that the men felt in their boots before they understood it. They had pulled the dull bit, fixed a fresh one, and were lowering the long string of pipe back down toward the bottom of the hole when the mud standing in the borehole began, without warning, to rise. It bubbled up over the floor of the rig, slow at first, and then in a surge. Then came the rumble, and then the roar, and the whole derrick shook as though it would tear loose from the ground. Kurt Hamel was working at the top of the rig when it let go. He fought his way down the ladder for his life as 6 tons of 4-inch drilling pipe came blasting up out of the borehole, knocking through the derrick and flinging lengths of steel into the air like straws. Then, strangely, the well fell silent. For several minutes the 3 men, Al Hamel and his brother Kurt, and their fireman, Will Bird, stood in the wreckage and stared at a quiet hole. And then it came again, mud first, then a hiss of gas, and finally the oil, a solid black column that punched up through the ruined derrick and climbed more than 100 feet into the Texas sky, and by some accounts half again as high. The first thing Kurt Hamel did was run back toward the danger. With the gusher throwing oil and gas into the air in a fine, drifting spray, the entire hill had become a single spark away from an inferno, and the steam boiler that powered the rig was still burning. Kurt, the older brother, heavier and stronger than Al, went back into the storm of oil to shut down the derrick floor machinery and kill the boiler fire before it killed them all. Captain Lucas was not even there to see it. He had gone into Beaumont and reached the well only after the column was already standing, taller than the trees. When he arrived, by the accounts that survive, he embraced the three drillers, soaked black to the skin, and then he did the one thing the moment demanded. He hurried back to town and wired John Gailey in Pittsburgh to come at once. The men had prayed for 50 barrels a day. The hill had given them 100,000, and for 9 days it would not stop giving. There is a cruelty in the timing worth pausing on. The man who had first sworn there was oil beneath that hill, who had been mocked as the millionaire, and cast out of his own company and written out of the partnership that finally drilled it, was nowhere on the hill the morning it came in. Pattillo Higgins did not stand in the spray. He did not wire Pittsburgh. His name would not be on the well at all, for the whole country was about to know it as the Lucas Gusher, after the engineer who drilled it, and never the prophet who found it. Higgins had been right about everything except the only thing that finally mattered, which was who would be standing on the ground at the moment of his vindication. The numbers had no precedent anywhere in the country. A good well in the older fields of Pennsylvania, or in the small field at Corsicana, produced perhaps 50 barrels of oil in a day. The Lucas Gusher produced 100,000. By itself, that single well threw out more oil than every other producing well in the United States combined. In one day, it yielded more than 1/10 of what the entire state of Texas had pumped in the whole of the previous year, and across the 9 days it ran wild. It threw out close to 900,000 barrels, most of it onto the open prairie, never measured, never barreled, simply lost. The roar of it carried for miles. No American had ever seen such a thing, and the nearest comparison anyone could summon was a half-believed rumor from the far side of the world, of the giant wells at Baku on the Caspian Sea, which, to most people in Texas, had always sounded like a traveler's exaggeration. The exaggeration was now standing in a field 3 miles south of Beaumont, raining oil. For 9 days the gusher ran without check because no one on earth knew how to stop it. The technology to cap a well of that pressure did not exist, for the simple reason that no well of that pressure had ever existed. Oil fell back to earth and spread, and a black lake formed around the base of the derrick, wider by the hour, soaking into the soil and running into the creeks and ditches of the coastal plain, killing the grass and the fish, and fouling the water for miles. It was a fortune lying in the open, in plain sight, and not 1 barrel of it could yet be sold. The richest thing anyone in Texas had ever laid eyes on was also, for 9 days, the largest thing anyone had ever wasted, and all of it sat 1 spark from annihilation. The danger of fire was so total that Captain Lucas posted armed guards to order back the crowds that were already gathering, and to keep every pipe, every match, every shod hoof and iron wheel away from the drifting spray. Men worked in oil-soaked clothes that could ignite from a single static spark. The thing that would shortly light the lamps and drive the engines of a new century was, in those first days, treated like an unexploded shell, something to be approached only with terror and held at gunpoint until it could be tamed. Taming it fell, as everything else had, to the Hamels. With no precedent to follow and no tool built for the job, the brothers improvised. For days they studied the thing they had made, a column of oil and gas under a pressure no equipment on Earth was designed to hold, and worked out how a man might get near enough to choke it without striking the one spark that would turn the whole hill into a pillar of fire. Working in the blinding spray, half drowned in crude, they devised an arrangement of valves and heavy fittings to clamp down over the wellhead and throttle the flow. It was a crude and dangerous contraption, assembled by trial against a force that could have killed them at any moment, and it was the first rough ancestor of the wellhead assembly the oil industry still uses and still calls, to this day, a Christmas tree. On the 19th of January, 1901, 9 days after the well had blown, they brought the Lucas Gusher under control. The column fell. The roar that had carried for miles stopped. A vast pool of oil lay around the derrick, glistening in the winter light, and the air over the hill went thick and still. A new age had begun. It had begun, in part, in the imaginations of the people who came to see it. They had begun arriving within the hour, drawn by the noise and by rumors spreading from the country store, coming out from Beaumont in buggies and on horseback and on foot, until a crowd stood pressed against a fence 150 feet from the well, watching in fear and wonder as the black column tore at the sky. Every shift of the wind drove a spray of oil back over them. One onlooker would describe it as a big column of midnight blackness rising out of the earth. In Beaumont itself, 3 miles away, the oil came in on the Gulf breeze and settled over the town, staining the white houses with black and orange, and the sulfur gas came with it, until people walked the streets holding cloths to their faces. Some residents, watching a black rain fall from a clear sky and breathing the rotten air, gathered to pray, certain that the end of the world had come. It was not the end of the world. It was the beginning of an industry, and the hill did not stop at one well. Within weeks, derricks were rising across the mound as fast as crews could raise them, crowded so close that a man could step from one to the next. New gushers came in through the spring, one after another, on the Gladys City lands and on every tract around them, and by the following summer more than a dozen wells were flowing on a hill the experts had sworn held nothing at all. The oil itself almost ceased to be the point. The land became the prize. Ground that had sold for the price of pasture when it grew nothing but rice and cattle now changed hands for fortunes, and then changed hands again the same afternoon for more. A lease on a patch of Spindletop dirt could lift a poor man into wealth between breakfast and supper, and ruin a careless one by nightfall. And as the money came, so did the men who lived on money rather than on oil. The Lucas Gusher had proved the hill. Now the hill, and the tide of fortune-seekers swarming toward it, would prove something darker about the country the oil was about to enrich. Beaumont was about to become the richest and most lawless ground in America, and the men who had just stood in the spray calling the Gusher a miracle would very soon be calling the place by another name. Before the 10th of January, Beaumont had been a sleepy sawmill town on the Neches River, a place of rice fields and cypress lumber and perhaps 10,000 souls. Within 3 months its population had tripled, and before the boom crested it would reach 50,000. They came by every train and every road, oil workers and engineers, yes, but behind them a second army of merchants, gamblers, prostitutes, liquor sellers, land agents, and confidence men, all of them drawn by the same black column the prophets of the Bible might have followed. Beaumont had no housing for them, no sanitation for them, and very little law. Men slept in tents, in shacks, in the open, 4 and 6 to a bed, in rooms rented by the shift. The streets turned to a stew of mud and oil. Higgins had once drawn careful plans for a clean industrial city he would call Gladys City, What rose instead was a sprawl of canvas and raw lumber thrown up overnight, and there was nothing clean about it. The town could not feed or house what arrived. Boarding houses charged by the 8-hour shift and rented the same bed 3 times a day. Fresh water was scarce and foul. Prices for an egg or a night's lodging climbed to match the price of land, and disease moved easily through the crowded camps. The one island of relative order in the chaos was the Crosby House, Beaumont's principal hotel, whose lobby became the unofficial exchange of the entire boom. It was there, among the promoters and the deal-makers, that the serious men did their serious business, and it was there, before the year was out, that a handful of them would sit down together and lay the foundations of a company that still sells gasoline today. But that belongs to the next part of the story. In the streets outside the Crosby House, the business was a great deal wilder. On the hill itself, the chaos took a physical form that can still be seen in the old photographs and that defies belief. Because every owner of every scrap of ground had the right to drill it, and because no one knew how long the oil would last, the land was carved into smaller and smaller parcels, each one a separate lease, each one bristling with its own derrick. The wooden towers rose so close together that their legs nearly touched, a forest of them standing leg to leg across the mound, thicker than the pines they were cut from. On the Hog Swain tract, the most notorious of them, derricks stood almost on top of one another, drilling within feet of their neighbors into the same shrinking pool. It was, to the eye, a marvel. To anyone who understood oil pressure, which almost no one yet did, it was a slow suicide, every well stealing from every other and bleeding away the underground force that drove them all. It was also a fire waiting to happen, with wooden derricks crowded leg to leg and crude standing in open pits between them. A single careless flame could turn whole blocks of the field into an inferno, and more than once fire did sweep the hill, sending up black smoke that could be seen for many miles. Yet the fires, terrible as they were the danger men could see. The deeper ruin was the one no one was watching, and it was already underway, quietly, beneath their boots. The land beneath those derricks became worth more than the oil that came out of it. The numbers from those months read like fever. A tract on Spindletop that had sold for $450 in the year 1900 was bought the following year by a syndicate headed by the former governor of Texas, James Hogg, for $105,000. A man who for 3 years had been unable to find a single buyer for his land at $150 suddenly sold it for $20,000. Ground was traded by the square foot. Fortunes were made between breakfast and supper and lost again before the saloons closed, and the saloons did not close. Speculation, not petroleum, had become the real product of Spindletop. The miracle and the con had arrived on the same train, and for most of the people who poured their savings into Spindletop, the con was the part that found them first. Through all of this, the man who had started it received almost nothing, and what he received he had to fight for. Pattillo Higgins, frozen out of the Lucas partnership before the well came in, watched other men grow rich on the hill he had spent a decade insisting held oil. He went to court. He sued Lucas and the Gladys City Company over the royalties he believed he was owed, arguing that the lease that had cut him out was not even legally valid, and after a long fight, the parties settled out of court. Higgins took his money and his leases and built a company of his own, the Higgins Oil and Fuel Company, planted in the very center of Spindletop, and before long one of his own wells came roaring in. For a brief moment the prophet was an oil producer on his own hill at last. It did not last. Higgins had a compulsive habit of buying up far more land than his company could defend, and the overreach left the firm vulnerable. In 1902, the lumber baron John Henry Kirby bought Higgins out of his own company for $3 million. $3 million was a fortune, and Higgins was not, in the end, a poor man. But set it against what the hill produced, against the empires being built on it by men who had once called him a fool, and the figure is a kind of insult. The dreamer who had seen the whole thing, the planned city, the oil, the future, before anyone else believed a word of it, was paid to go away. He left Beaumont, the town that had laughed at him, and then refused to honor him, and spent the rest of his long life prospecting other ground, making other men rich, pulling his own interests out early in deal after deal, as though he could not quite bear to be present at the moment of his own success. The man who had been right got a lawsuit and a buyout. The men who had doubted him got an industry. For the swindlers, the boom would burn itself out fast, as swindles do, and the 500 paper companies would mostly vanish into the courts and the wastebaskets within a few short years. But while the confidence men sold air, and Higgins fought for his scraps, a small number of clear-eyed and ruthless men were moving through the same crowded streets with something else in mind. They were not buying paper. They were buying pipelines and refineries and storage tanks and the steady machinery of an industry. The men who would matter were already among the derricks, and the companies they were quietly assembling out of the chaos of Swindletop would still be household names 100 years later, long after every con artist was forgotten and the hill itself lay silent. The men who would matter understood something the swindlers and most of the wildcatters did not. The fortune at Spindletop was not in any single well, which could be drilled out in a season, nor in any lease, which could be flipped and forgotten. The fortune was in control of the whole chain, from the oil in the ground to the pipeline that carried it, to the refinery that turned it into kerosene and fuel, to the tank cars and the markets that sold it. The wildcatter gambled on a hole in the ground. The men who built the empires gambled on the system. They were buying not paper, but pipe, not the dream of a gusher, but the machinery of an industry. And out of the noise and filth of Swindletop, they assembled corporations that would outlive everyone present by a century. The oil age had been born in a single morning. The oil business was built in the 3 years that followed, and it was built largely by Pittsburgh. It was built, above all, by the Mellons. The deep money behind Guffey and Gailey had always been theirs, and once the hill came in, they moved to take what their money had bought. In the spring of 1901, they organized the J.M. Guffey Petroleum Company to hold the Spindletop production, and Guffey, the front man, held a 7/15 share, while Andrew Mellon, his brother Richard, and a circle of their Pittsburgh associates held the rest. That same year, the Mellons organized a second firm, the Gulf Refining Company, to refine and sell the crude, and they built it a great refinery down on the coast at Port Arthur. It was a complete machine for making money out of oil, and it had been assembled almost entirely by a single banking family 600 miles away. What happened next is the part the triumphant histories tend to hurry past. The field began to fail almost as soon as the empire was built on it. By the autumn of 1902, the Mellons had sunk some $6 million into the two companies, and Spindletop's once impossible flow was already collapsing under the weight of all those crowded derricks. The enterprise that the Gusher had made suddenly stood close to bankruptcy. To save it, Andrew Mellon put his nephew, William Larimer Mellon, in active charge, with orders to run the thing with an iron hand. And for 5 hard years, from 1902 to 1907, only ruthless management kept Guffey and Gulf from going under as the Texas oil drained away beneath them. They survived their birthplace by outlasting it. In January of 1907, the pieces were welded together into a single great corporation under the presidency of Andrew Mellon, and it took the name of the body of water off the Texas coast. It was called the Gulf Oil Corporation. Gulf would become one of the largest companies in America, one of the so-called Seven Sisters that would divide the oil of the world between them, and for most of a century it would remain a chief instrument of the Mellon fortune, its headquarters and the family's bank, rising side by side in downtown Pittsburgh. In time, the Mellons would crown the city with the Gulf Building, an Art Deco tower that stood as the tallest in Pittsburgh for decades, its illuminated peak changing color with the coming weather, visible for miles, a beacon of oil money over the river town that had financed the gamble. And these were the same Mellons whose private bank would, within 20 years, place Andrew Mellon himself at the head of the United States Treasury, where through the whole of the 1920s he would labor to cut the taxes on great fortunes, fortunes exactly like the one a Texas salt dome had just handed his family. The bank had financed the gamble, and the bank now owned the prize, as the Mellon Bank had always had a way of owning whatever it financed. The Mellons were not alone on the hill. In a suite at the Crosby House, the Beaumont Hotel, whose lobby served as the boom's great exchange, another empire was being drawn up on hotel stationery. Its architect was Joseph Cullinan, the hard former Standard Oil pipeline man who had come down from the Corsicana field. There was a particular irony in Cullinan. He had spent his early career inside Rockefeller's machine, learning exactly how Standard Oil gathered and refined and dominated the oil of a region, and he was now turning that hard education against his old masters, raising on the Texas coast a major company that Standard would never control. Around him gathered a remarkable collection of operators. There was the former governor of Texas, James Hogg, whose syndicate had bought and subdivided some of the richest ground on the hill. There was John Warren Gates, a steel and barbed wire speculator so reckless with money that he was known across the country as Bet-A-Million Gates. There was Arnold Schlate, a cautious New York financier sent to watch the others. In 1901, these men chartered the Texas Fuel Company, and on the 1st of May, 1902, they reorganized it into the Texas Company, capitalized now at $3 million, having begun with $50,000. It absorbed the Hogg-Swain holdings, it built its own pipelines and refineries, and in time it would put a red star and a green T on filling stations from coast to coast and call itself Texaco. And still the list grew. The Sun Oil Company, the firm of the Pugh family of Philadelphia, came to Spindletop for its crude and built its own works on the Gulf. The Magnolia Petroleum Company, which would one day be folded into Mobil, rose out of the same Texas oil. And near a little town called Humble, just up the coast, the discoveries that Spindletop had inspired would give rise to the Humble Oil and Refining Company, the firm that would grow into the American arm of what is now Exxon. Gulf, Texaco, Sun, Mobil, Exxon. The role of companies that trace their origin or their first great expansion to that Salt Dome Hill reads like a directory of the 20th century oil industry. They were not born in a boardroom in New York or a laboratory in the East. They were born in the mud and smoke of Beaumont, Texas, in the space of about 3 years. There was a cost to this consolidation that the celebrations would forget. The boom had promised that any man with nerve and a lease could strike it rich, and for one brief season a few of them did. But the integrated corporation, with its pipelines and its refineries and its Pittsburgh bank, did to the Texas wildcatter what Standard Oil had done to the independent refiner a generation before. It made him, in the end, optional. The oil would now belong to the men who controlled the entire system, and the system was costly enough to build that only the already rich could build it. Spindletop had broken one monopoly, and in the very same motion it had laid the foundations of the handful of giants that would replace it. This was the deepest consequence of the Gusher, deeper even than the wealth, and it is the one most worth understanding. Before Spindletop, the American oil industry was very nearly one company. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled something close to 9 of every 10 barrels refined in the country, a monopoly so complete that it set prices and crushed rivals at will. John Archbold, the man who ran Standard Oil day to day for Rockefeller, had years before scoffed at the very idea of Western oil, declaring that if any worthwhile field were ever found out there, I will drink every gallon of oil produced west of the Mississippi. Standard had been offered a share of Spindletop and had turned it down, and so the great companies that grew out of the Texas coast, Gulf and Texaco and Sun were the first oil powers in a generation that Standard Oil did not control and could not swallow. Consider what that hill set loose. From the chaos of Swindletop came Gulf Oil, the spine of the Mellon fortune. There came the Texas Company, which became Texaco, raised from $50,000 to $3 million in a single year. There came Sun Oil and Magnolia, which became Mobil, and the seed of Humble, which became Exxon. Several of these would sit one day among the Seven Sisters, the handful of firms that controlled the oil of the entire world. And John Archbold, the man who had offered to drink the West's oil, lived to watch the Supreme Court of the United States break Standard Oil itself into 34 pieces in 1911, its monopoly shattered, the center of American oil gravity dragged south and west to the Gulf Coast and Oklahoma, away from the eastern fields it had ruled. Those 34 fragments would themselves become household names. Standard Oil of New Jersey grew into Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. A century later, the familiar signs at every American intersection would be, on the one hand, the broken shards of Rockefeller's monopoly, and on the other, the children of a Texas salt dome, the two halves of an industry that Spindletop had pried open. The empire that had refused Spindletop was dismantled, in part, by the rivals Spindletop had created. It was, by any measure, a staggering inheritance for a single Texas hill to leave the country. But it carried within it a bitter and almost unnoticed irony, the same irony the Mellons had already discovered when their new company nearly failed in 1902. The empires were real and permanent and enormous. The field that made them was neither. Even as the lawyers in Pittsburgh drew up the papers of the Gulf Oil Corporation in 1907, the hill those papers were founded on had already given up most of what it held. The companies would endure for 100 years. Their birthplace would not last 10. The same crowded greed that had raised the derrick's leg to leg was, by then, well advanced in the work of destroying the very field it had come to plunder, and to that destruction, and what it did to the men who had banked everything on the oil never running out, the story turns next. The thing that destroyed Spindletop was not bad luck, and it was not exhaustion in the ordinary sense. It was the very crowding that had made the hill so spectacular to look at. An oil field of that kind is driven by pressure. The oil does not sit in a hollow cavern waiting to be dipped out. It is held in the pores of the rock under enormous natural force, much of it the pressure of trapped gas, and it is that pressure, and that pressure alone, that drives the oil up the well and into the air. The gas is the engine, and the engine could be wasted. Every derrick punched into the hill opened another vent for the gas to escape, and every barrel drawn from the pool lowered the force that drove the next. With hundreds of wells crowded leg to leg into a few acres, all of them drawing at once, the field was being bled of its own driving power faster than anyone realized, and once that pressure was gone, no amount of drilling could bring it back. What made the slaughter unstoppable was the law. Under the rule that governed oil in those years, the rule of capture, the oil belonged not to the man under whose ground it had lain for millions of years, but to whoever pumped it to the surface first. A barrel left politely in the ground was simply a barrel that a neighbor, drilling 40 feet away, would draw out and sell. Restraint was not merely difficult under such a rule. Restraint was irrational. The only sane response to a field that everyone was draining was to drain it faster, and so every man on the hill did exactly that, racing his neighbors to empty a pool they all shared, each one certain that if he did not take the oil, the derrick next door would. They were not behaving badly by the logic of the time. They were behaving sensibly, and sensible behavior was killing the richest oil field on earth. And a great deal of what they pumped was simply thrown away. There was nowhere to put it. The oil came out of the ground faster than anyone could build tanks to hold it or pipelines to carry it, and so the overflow was run into open earthen pits, vast reeking ponds of crude scraped into the dirt, where it sat in the Texas heat and evaporated and seeped back into the ground, and now and then caught fire. With derricks standing in forests and oil lying in open pools between them, fire was a constant terror, and more than once it came, sweeping across the crowded hill and sending up columns of greasy black smoke, consuming the very wealth the men had ruined the field to obtain. The waste was on a scale to match the abundance. A fortune had come out of the ground, and an appalling share of it was lost to the air, the dirt, and the flames before it could ever be sold. And what the oil touched, it ruined. The open pits leached crude into the soil and the shallow water beneath it. The creeks and bayous that drained the hill ran fouled and iridescent. The grass died, the fish died, the cattle that had once grazed the prairie could no longer drink there, and the scars the gushers tore in the land would outlast the men who made them by generations. The mound south of Beaumont had been working pasture and farmland before the 10th of January, 1901. It would never be either again. What could be sold collapsed in value because there was simply too much of it. The flood of Spindletop crude and the floods from the fields it inspired up and down the coast overwhelmed every market and every tank in the region, and the price of oil fell through the floor. Crude that had sold for more than $1 a barrel before the Gusher dropped and dropped as the glut spread, until at the worst of it oil at Spindletop sold for as little as 3 cents a barrel. Men said, only half in jest, that oil had become cheaper than water, and on that hill, in those months, it very nearly was. The collapse rippled outward. Producers in the older fields, men who had spent years building modest fortunes on oil at $1 or $2, watched their incomes wither as Texas crude undercut them. The speculators who had bought into the 500 paper companies at the height of the frenzy found their certificates worth precisely what the prairie behind them was worth, which was nothing. The collapse fell hardest, as collapses do, on the people with the least to cushion it. The farmers who had walked off their land to learn the oil trade, the merchants who had stocked their shelves for a city of 50,000, the boarding-house keepers and the teamsters, the men who had borrowed against a lease that was suddenly worth nothing, all of them watched the boom drain away as fast as the oil had. Beaumont, which had swollen overnight, began to shrink almost as quickly as the crowd that had come for the miracle followed the miracle elsewhere. The town itself would survive, changed past recognition, a genuine oil city now of refineries and railroads and Gulf Coast shipping. But the fever that had tripled its population in a single season broke, and a great many of those it had drawn to the hill drifted away poorer than they had arrived, having paid to watch other men get rich. The numbers of the collapse mirror the numbers of the boom turned upside down. At its peak, the field had produced more than 17 million barrels in the single year of 1902. Land that had sold for $10 an acre had changed hands, at the height of the madness, for as much as 900,000. More than 285 wells had been crowded onto the hill, chartered by some 600 companies. And then everything ran backward. The price, which had stood above $1, fell to as little as 3 cents a barrel. The flow, which had once thrown 100,000 barrels a day into the sky, was down by February of 1904 to 10,000. The field had peaked in 1902, begun its decline that same year, and within 10 years of the greatest oil strike the world had ever seen, the hill that produced it stood very nearly a ghost town, its derricks rotting, its boom camps emptied, its silence broken only by the few pumps still drawing what little the pressure could push. The men and the companies who could move on did. The oil industry that Spindletop had created now did to Spindletop what it would do to 100 fields after it. It took what it could take, as fast as it could take it, and then it left. The great corporations had refineries to feed and pipelines to fill, and they could not feed them on a dying hill, and so they went looking for the next Gusher, and the Texas Gulf Coast obliged. The boomers who had poured into Beaumont in 1901 drifted on with them from one short-lived field to the next, to Sour Lake and to Saratoga, to Batson Prairie, to the town of Humble up the coast, to Goose Creek, and then beyond Texas entirely, to the great new fields opening in Oklahoma. The companies followed the oil north and west. Gulf and the Texas Company laid pipelines to reach the Oklahoma pools because the hill that had given them their names could no longer give them enough oil to matter. The wildcatters chased the boom across the map, and behind them they left a string of emptied towns, each one a smaller Beaumont, each one a smaller Spindletop, the same brief frenzy and the same long silence repeated again and again. Across the century, the Gusher had opened. There is no neat moral to draw from it, but the shape of the thing is worth sitting with. The men who plundered Spindletop were not punished for their greed. They were rewarded for it lavishly right up until the moment the greed consumed the thing that fed it. The fortunes were real and they were kept. Gulf endured. Texaco endured. The Mellons grew only richer. It was the field itself, the actual hill, the salt dome that had waited beneath the prairie for an age before any human knew it was there, that paid the whole bill. It had been found and drilled and drained and abandoned, all inside a single decade, by an industry that learned from it everything except restraint. Spindletop became the first great lesson in what the rule of capture did to an oil field, the textbook case of a treasure destroyed by the very rush to seize it. It was a lesson the industry and the state of Texas understood almost at once and would nonetheless spend the next 30 years refusing to act on, draining field after field the same wasteful way, until oil pools far larger than Spindletop finally forced the questions of conservation and proration onto the law. The Hill had shown everyone, as early as 1904, exactly how the thing would go wrong. It simply took a generation and a great deal more waste before anyone was willing to listen to a dead field. And yet the Hill was not quite finished, even then. The men who walked away in 1904 believed they had emptied it, and for a generation it would lie quiet and broken, a monument to its own ruin. But the salt dome was larger and deeper than the first frenzy had understood, and a day was coming, more than 20 years on, when new men with new machines would return to the silent hill and prove that the Spindletop the world remembered had been only the beginning of what lay beneath it. The boom was over. The story of the hill was not. For nearly 20 years after the bust, Spindletop was what the rest of the played-out boom towns were, a diminished field and a half-deserted hill, a place the oil industry had used and discarded. The derricks rotted, the pits dried, the crowds were long gone, scattered across a dozen newer fields. And then, in the middle of the 1920s, a few stubborn men looked at the silent hill and refused to believe it was empty. A speculator named Mars McLean argued that the oil lay on the flanks of the salt dome, around its edges, where no one had thought to drill. An oil man named Miles Yunt believed it lay deeper than the first boom had ever reached. They were both right. In November of 1925, the Yunt-Lee Oil Company brought in a flank well far below the depths the first frenzy had touched, and Spindletop boomed a second time. And here the hill delivered its final irony to the men who thought they had conquered it. The second field was bigger than the first, by far. The Caprock pool that the wildcatters had drained and abandoned in 1904 had been, it turned out, only the shallow lid on something much greater. The flanks of the dome and the deeper sands held many times the oil of the original strike. Spindletop reached its all-time annual peak not in the famous year of the Lucas Gusher, but in 1927, when it produced 21 million barrels, and in the 5 years after the flank discovery, it gave up 60 million more. Before it was finished, the hill would yield over 150 million barrels of oil. The men of the first boom had destroyed the field's pressure, wasted its crude in open pits, crashed its price to 3 cents, and walked away, certain they had emptied it, and all the while they had been standing on 10 times more oil than they took, separated from it by nothing but a little more patience than any of them possessed. The second boom was a more disciplined affair than the first. Miles Yunt built the company that found the deeper oil into one of the largest independent operators on the entire Gulf Coast, and the men of the 1920s, with the ruin of the first frenzy still in living memory, drilled with at least some thought for conservation. But the appetite for the hill had not changed in a generation. In the keenest of the new competition, a single acre of Spindletop ground sold for $200,000, and the wells reached down through depths the first wildcatters could never have managed, into sands they never knew were there. The one man who had always counseled that patience lived to see the second boom, and a good deal more. Pattillo Higgins, frozen out of the first fortune and bought out of his own company, never stopped prospecting. For half a century after the Lucas Gusher, he searched for oil across South Texas, founding company after company, finding more of it than most professional geologists ever did, and making, in the end, a comfortable living. But he never became the oil baron the hill might have made him, in part because of a strange and revealing habit. Again and again, Higgins would assemble a promising venture and then pull his own interest out early, leaving the great profits to the men who came after him, as though he were drawn to the act of being right and indifferent to the act of being rich. He had been right about the oil. He had been right about the salt dome when every trained expert in America called him a fool. He had been right about the planned city, the industry, the future, the whole staggering thing. The only success he never managed was simply to be present when the rewards were handed out. And yet the town came around to him at the last. In 1951, Beaumont staged a great celebration for the 50th anniversary of the Lucas Gusher, a week of parades and pageants and radio broadcasts, and at the head of the parade of progress, riding through the streets of the town that had once mocked him as the millionaire, sat Pattillo Higgins, by then 89 years old, smiling thinly at the vindication of a prophecy that had taken 50 years to be believed. The boy who had lost his arm in a gunfight, the brawler turned Sunday school teacher, the brickmaker who had read his way to a truth the geologists could not see, had outlived nearly everyone who laughed at him. History would give him a single name in the end. They would call him the prophet of Spindletop. He died in San Antonio in 1955 at the age of 91, 4 years after the town finally honored him, more than 50 years after the hill he found made other men into kings. The engineer fared little better than the prophet. Captain Anthony Lucas, who had drilled the well that carried his name, held only his 1/8 share when the Pittsburgh men were finished, and like Higgins, he never grew rich on the greatest oil discovery in American history. He left the boom behind and went back to the quiet work of a consulting engineer, his salt dome theory, so long ridiculed, now vindicated across the whole of the Gulf Coast, and he died in 1921, 2 decades after his Gusher remade the world. The profession that had once laughed at his ideas would in time honor his name. But the pattern held to the very end. The man who found the oil and the man who drilled it both walked away with a fraction, while the bank in Pittsburgh kept the empire. When Beaumont staged its great anniversary parade in 1951, it was Lucas's son and the aging driller Al Hamill, still spry at 75, who rode through the streets beside old Higgins, 3 survivors of a single winter morning that had made a great many people rich, and the 3 of them, in the fullest measure, least of all. Set against everything it became, the boom that ate itself in 3 years comes to seem almost a footnote. Reckon up the whole of it. The Caprock field the wildcatters drained had given a little over 17 million barrels at its peak. The deeper field they abandoned gave 60 million in 5 years and more than 150 million before it was done. From the hill came Gulf and Texaco and Sun and the firms that grew into Mobil and Exxon, several of them among the handful of giants that would one day divide the oil of the entire world. It carried the United States to the head of every oil-producing nation on Earth and pushed the country bodily into the age of the automobile, the age of cheap fuel and the engine, the world we still live in. The wars of the new century would be won and lost on oil. The highways and the suburbs and the whole restless motion of American life would run on it. and a great deal of that future had been set loose by a single salt dome hill in southeast Texas on a January morning when the cheap fuel a brickmaker had gone looking for came out of the ground in a quantity no one had imagined possible. And the hill that did all of this no longer exists. So much oil and brine and sulfur was drawn out from beneath it across the following decades that the ground itself began to sink, the dome slowly deflating back into the prairie, until the pink granite monument that had been raised in 1941 to mark the spot grew unstable on the settling earth and had to be lifted and carried away to safer ground. Spindletop is not a hill today. It is a flat and quiet field, and where the greatest gusher in the world once stood, there is a flagpole. There is one last turn to the wheel, and it is the kind of turn the whole story seems to have been building toward. Higgins's careful plans for Gladys City, the clean industrial town he had drawn up on the prairie in 1892, were never built as he imagined them. They exist today only as a reconstruction, a cluster of replica clapboard buildings beside a replica wooden derrick, raised by a university as a museum so that visitors might walk through the boomtown the way it never quite was. And the two great companies the hill produced, Gulf Oil and Texaco, the rivals that Spindletop raised up precisely because they were everything Standard Oil was not, did not in the end escape the gravity of the empire they were born to break. Before the century was out, both of them were swallowed by Chevron, the modern name of Standard Oil of California, itself one of the 34 pieces the Supreme Court had broken Rockefeller's monopoly into in 1911. The wheel turned all the way around. The children of the hill ended their independent lives inside a child of the very empire they had been created to destroy, and the oil business, having been pried open at Spindletop, closed again into a few enormous hands, as it always seems, in the end, to do. That is the truth the hill leaves behind, under the flat field and the single flagpole. Spindletop was not really the story of a gusher. It was the story of how American power changes its shape without ever changing its nature. The fortune moved from cotton to lumber to oil, from the land to the bank, from Beaumont to Pittsburgh, and at every stage the same thing happened that had happened to Pattillo Higgins on the hill he found. The men who saw it first and worked it hardest and stood closest to the danger were moved gently aside, and the men who controlled the money kept the empire. The oil age was born one cold January morning on a low Texas hill that has since sunk into the ground. The empire it built is still standing. The salt dome beneath Spindletop had waited tens of millions of years for the men who came for it, and they took everything it held in less than a single human lifetime. What they built outlasted them, and outlasted the hill itself. The companies endured. The Mellon fortune endured. The prophet, the engineer, the drillers, the swindlers, the boomtown, and the field have all passed, and the ground has long since closed quietly over the place where the century turned. The empire was permanent. The hill that made it was not. The story of how American power was built on land and oil, and the ruin of those who reached them first, is far from finished.